In the previous lesson, we got introduced how we can create a simple form, adding in labels and labeling the various inputs. And we also looked at how we can add a submit button at the bottom, and the input type submit defines a button for submitting the form data. And it's essentially the way that we can do the form handler. So clicking this button, and it does create a button object on the page. You can also update the button value by updating the button value, adding an attribute of value. So if you want to update it from submit, it would still be a submit button, but the value that the user sees is going to be different on top of the button labeling. And currently, when we press submit, we're actually submitting to the same URL because we're not actually specifying a different web URL. And this is where the attribute of action comes in. And this is where we can specify the page, the end page where we want to submit our content to. So if we had a page called mail PHP, and if I refresh it, I hit and submit the button, and I actually don't have a web page called mail PHP, but we see that it will submit the content to that page. So whatever is being specified within the action area, this is where it's submitting that content to. You can also update and submit the target. So if you want it to target it, just as we saw with our hyperlinks, we can specify a target, and if we do blank and refresh it, this is going to open up a separate window where it's going to be submitting to the web page that we specified within the action. So that's another option with forms, is you can also specify the target. And the default value is self, and that means that it's taking the same page that you're on and it's submitting it to itself. There's also an option for different attributes. So by default, we were using get, and there's also post method. So the default is to use get, and get is used for form data. But the thing with the form data, and to keep in mind that this is going to be visible within the page address. So just as we saw several times whenever we submit it, that content using get is going to be visible within the page content. So it's not as secure, and it appends the form data to the URL that we're trying to send to. There is also a limit length, so you can't send unlimited amount of characters. You are limited to 2,448 characters, which is a lot of characters. So it can potentially send quite a bit of information, but there is a limit. So keeping that in mind, and especially if you have those large text areas of content that are being submitted, and we are going to look at text areas as well, that could get fairly lengthy. Also, never use get for sensitive information. So that's one of the rules when you are submitting content. You want to try to be as secure with that content as possible, and sending it over get is because it's visible within the URL. It's not a great way to provide security for the content. Also, it's useful for the form submissions. So if the user wants to submit their content and bookmark the content that they've submitted, they're able to do that because this is, again, sitting within the web URL, and it's able to be bookmarked by the user as well as be able to be seen by the user. So it's good for basic query strings, but it's bad for security. And if you do want more security, that's when you would using post. So post has no size limitations. So if we update the method to post, there's no size limitations, so you can send large amounts of data, and also the post content won't be bookmarked. So when we do press post, there's no more values that are being passed within the web URL. It's just hidden behind the scenes and sent to the page without having it visible to the user that the content is actually being sent. If the name attribute within the input fields, if you omit this, then that value, even on post and on get, this input value is not going to be sent properly. So this is a must-have field within the input fields in order for your form to work properly. There's also another attribute that you might find is used fairly often, is the encrypt. So this attribute, what this does is this specifies the encoding of the submission. So you can do it as plain text, multi-part form data, or application form URL encoded. So we want to just, if we want to send it as plain text, then this is going to then send this content as plain text. And the encryption is going to be driven by what the end source is going to require, how the data is going to be transferred, and what it's going to require to pick up that data. So depending on what the receiving code is expecting, that's how you would select whether to encrypt it and how to encrypt it. So there's also autocomplete as well. So there's a number of different attributes that you can add in here, and the default for autocomplete is on. So you've got a number of options here for the different autocomplete formats, and you can as well turn it off. The default of it is on, so you don't have to specify that it's on. It's always going to be on. But if you don't want autocomplete to work, then you can turn it off. And as you might have noticed before, when I click on the input field, I was getting the drop down to autocomplete. As soon as I added the autocomplete off, then it's no longer asking for that. It's no longer providing that drop down within any of the fields within this particular form element that are all the elements that are there. With HTML5, we have the ability to make sure that our form fields are required, so that if we have an input and if it's blank, then we can stop the submission of that form until the content is added, and that's required content. So if we add in the attribute of required within the input area and refresh, and I gotta get rid of that content that's in there. And remember, these are just the placeholder values. When I press me, I get this pop-up, and this is with HTML5. This was new with HTML5. Before we had to do all of this with JavaScript, but now we have the ability of stopping the form submission. If we do have a field that's required, then we have the required on there. You can also void the validation by adding the no validate attribute to the top of the form. So once again, let's clear out some of this content, and once again, we're able to submit the form contents. So there's a lot of different types of form elements, and we're going to be going through all the different form elements in the upcoming lesson. But before we do, we're going to actually update this and have the content be submitted, where we're going to be submitting it to our email address. And you can do that by doing the mail to, just as we saw with the hyperlink, and then typing in the email that you want it to go. And this is going to open up within the mail client when we press the submission. And I'll update this to be post, and I'll get rid of the target blank. So let's do a refresh and post, and now we see that it automatically submits to our mail client, and it populates the to address with the address within the action area attribute, and then it also adds in the input field content below within the content area of the email. So go ahead and try that out. Add in the mail to within the action. Check it to encrypt as plain text. You can also add in the method as post. Apply some fields within your form, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson.